Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the research, the articles, and the raw data to pull out those essential insights you need to stay truly informed. Just take a look around you, or even at yourself right now. Screens are absolutely everywhere.
They really are.
They're woven into the very fabric of our children's and adolescents' lives, from the moment they wake up until they finally close their eyes. It's just this constant, pervasive presence that we all navigate.
And this incredible ubiquity of screens, it naturally raises a critical, maybe even urgent question for parents, educators, health professionals, everyone, really. How is all this screen time actually impacting the psychological well-being of young people?
That's the core of it, isn't it? So our mission today is to unpack a really significant, large-scale study from 2018. It's by Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell, published in Preventive Medicine Reports. And this deep dive is crucial because, well, for years, the research on this very topic has been incredibly conflicting. I mean, really all over the place.
It really has. Some studies sounded alarms about harm, others found no real effect. Some even suggested potential benefits. It was confusing.
Yeah, exactly. It's led to a lot of intense debates among experts and health organizations about whether strict screen time limits are truly justified. It's been a confusing landscape for parents especially.
Which is precisely why this particular study is so valuable and why we're diving into it today. It surveyed over 40,000 children and adolescents across the U.S.
40,000, wow.
Yeah, huge number. And they used remarkably comprehensive measures to try and bring some much-needed clarity to this often debated subject. So our goal here is to distill the most important kind of actionable insights so you can quickly grasp what this truly means for young people today.
Okay, let's unpack the landscape leading up to this study then. For a while now, there's been this growing concern. You hear it from parents, from health professionals like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP.
Right, and educators too.
Definitely. The AAP, for instance, has long recommended limits on screen time, especially for preschool children, and sort of general suggestions for older kids.
And it's not just a U.S. thing either. The World Health Organization, the WHO, they even decided to include gaming disorder in its international classification of diseases.
Which is huge, right? Essentially classifying it as a recognized medical condition. That's a massive step.
It really is. It signals a global level of concern. But as you said, the research behind it, specifically looking at psychological well-being, has indeed been a bit of a mixed bag.
Right.
While we've had pretty solid evidence linking screen time to physical health things like obesity.
Yeah, that seems clear.
The psychological research was, like you said, inconsistent. Some studies showed negative associations, others found null effects, meaning no effect, and a few even pointed to potential benefits from more screen time.
Benefits.
Well, yeah, maybe in terms of connection or information access, perhaps. But this inconsistency, it led some researchers to really question the validity of strict screen time limits. They were asking, do we really have enough robust evidence to tell doctors to spend valuable appointment time discussing this?
So there was a real need for a clearer signal in the data.
Exactly, a need for something more definitive.
So enter this comprehensive study, which truly aimed to cut through that noise. And when I say comprehensive, I mean the scope is really impressive. This particular study used a huge national sample.
Yeah.
You said 40,337 U.S. children and adolescents, aged 2 to 17.
Right, pulled from the 2016 National Survey of Children's Health. That's a massive nationally representative data set.
So it's not just some small pilot study. This is significant.
Definitely. And their methodology was incredibly careful. So you had caregivers reporting on one randomly selected child per household.
Okay.
And crucially, they excluded children with 8 major conditions that could significantly affect daily functioning, things like autism or cerebral palsy.
Why did they do that?
Well, the idea was to ensure the results focus specifically on typical development and screen time without those other potentially complicating factors muddying the waters.
Makes sense. And how does they measure screen time itself?
They used comprehensive measures. So they combined time spent on traditional TV and video games and other electronic devices, computers, cell phones, handheld video games.
So everything together.
Exactly. To get a total daily screen time metric. And this was gathered for an average weekday.
Okay. And it wasn't just about the amount of screen time, right?
Yeah.
Because what really seems to set this study apart, beyond just the huge numbers, is what they chose to measure in terms of well-being.
Absolutely. They looked at a really broad array of psychological well-being measures. It went far beyond just asking, how happy are you?
Right.
They included things like emotional stability, relationships with caregivers, curiosity, self-control, a whole range.
Mm.
But what truly sets this study apart, I think, compared to many previous ones, is that it also looked at associations between screen time and actual clinical diagnoses of anxiety and depression.
Ah, okay. So not just feelings, but actual reported diagnoses.
Exactly. And also reports of professional mental health treatment. This just provided a much deeper look into how screen time might connect to real-world clinical outcomes.
So with all that careful data collection, what did they find? What were the main results?
Well, the initial finding was that the average total screen time across all these kids aged 2 to 17 was 3.20 hours a day.
3 hours and 12 minutes, roughly.
Yeah, yep. And maybe unsurprisingly, this increased quite a bit with age, especially that jump from elementary to middle school years.
I bet.
And for the older teens, 14 to 17-year-olds, it reached a pretty substantial 4 hours and 35 minutes a day on average.
Wow, over 4.5 hours.
And that was largely driven by electronic devices like phones and computers rather than just traditional TV.
Okay, that makes sense for teens. But what about the link to well-being?
Right, so this is where it gets really fascinating. They found what they called an inflection point, almost like a tipping point.
An inflection point. Explain that.
Yeah. So for most of the well-being measures they looked at, the kids who didn't use screens at all or who were very low users, we're talking around 1 hour a day.
Okay.
Those groups generally did not significantly differ in their psychological well-being. So in that first hour or so, there wasn't much difference detected.
Okay, interesting. So a little bit might be okay, or at least not measurably harmful in this data.
It seems that way based on these findings, but here's where it gets really interesting. After about 1 hour per day of screen time, the trend shifted quite dramatically.
So?
Increasing screen time beyond that hour was consistently linked to lower psychological well-being. It wasn't just a small blip. It was a clear, consistent pattern across the board.
Wow, so it's like a switch flips. Before that hour, maybe not much change, but after it, you see a measurable decline.
That's a good way to put it. It really was quite consistent. As screen time increased beyond that 1 hour mark, children and adolescents showed progressively lower psychological well-being across a whole range of indicators.
Like what specifically?
Okay, so let's take the high users, those spending 7 or more hours a day compared to the low users at just 1 hour a day. The high users had significantly worse outcomes.
7 hours or more. That's a lot.
It is. And they use something called relative risk to quantify this. It basically tells us how much more likely one group was to experience something compared to another.
Got it.
So among the 14 to 17-year-olds, these high users were more than twice as likely to, for example, not stay calm when challenged.
Twice as likely.
Yeah. Think about that. For every 10 low screen time teens who struggle to stay calm in a challenging situation, 20 high screen time teens face the same struggle.
That is a stark difference.
It is. They were also more than 2.5 times more likely to not finish tasks they started.
So issues with follow-through, maybe focus.
Seems like it. And nearly 3 times more likely to not be curious or interested in learning new things.
Oh, wow. That curiosity piece feels really important for development.
Definitely. And they were also 2.3 times more likely to argue too much with caregivers.
Okay, so affecting relationships too. And what about kids who weren't at that extreme 7+ hours, but still use screens quite a bit, like moderate users?
Good question. Even moderate users, defined in the study as around 4 hours a day, showed significantly lower well-being, although the effects were slightly smaller than for the high users.
Still significant, though.
Oh, yes. For instance, those 14 to 17-year-olds in the moderate group were still 78% more likely to not be curious compared to the low users. That's still a pretty substantial increase in risk.
And you mentioned age earlier. What really stood out was that these negative associations were generally larger and much more pronounced among the adolescents than among the younger children, right?
That's a crucial distinction, yes. And a really important takeaway from this study. It seems the older they got, the bigger the potential negative association became.
Okay, but what did they find for the younger kids, like preschoolers?
Right, so for preschool children, aged 2 to 5 years old, high users were also more likely to show some negative signs. They were more likely to lose their temper, less able to calm down when they got excited, and had more difficulty switching tasks without getting anxious or angry.
Okay.
The strongest connection they saw in this young age group was actually a significant drop in self-control for both the high users and the moderate users.
Self-control, okay. That feels foundational at that age.
It really does. Interestingly, though, for these preschoolers, there were few significant associations found with the direct social interaction items, things like showing affection or playing well with others.
Oh. So screen time didn't seem to affect their social skills at that age.
Well, the researchers noted something important here. They think it likely wasn't because screen time didn't impact social skills in preschoolers. Instead, it was probably because most caregivers, regardless of how much screen time their kid had, reported that their young children were already pretty good at playing and showing affection.
Ah, I see. So there just wasn't enough variation in the answers for the statistics to pick up a difference, like a ceiling effect.
Exactly. There wasn't enough difference in the responses on those specific questions to spot a significant link with screen time in this particular data set.
Okay, that makes sense. So this brings us to the more severe outcomes you mentioned earlier. If those findings about self-control and curiosity weren't concerning enough,
Yeah.
the study then turned its focus to something even more alarming: actual diagnosed mental health conditions, especially in that 14 to 17-year-old group.
That's right.
And the links between screen time and these diagnoses were pretty stark, weren't they?
They certainly were. For the older adolescents spending 7 or more hours a day with screens again, compared to those at just 1 hour a day, the numbers are truly striking.
Okay, let's hear them.
They were more than twice as likely to have ever been diagnosed with depression,
Wow.
and also more than twice as likely to have ever been diagnosed with anxiety.
Double the risk for both depression and anxiety diagnoses.
Yes. Furthermore, these high users were more likely to have seen or needed a mental health professional, and nearly 3 times as likely to have taken medication for a psychological or behavioral issue in the last 12 months.
3 times as likely to be on medication.
Yeah. I mean, when you hear numbers like twice as likely or 3 times as likely, it's a clear signal of a significant association, a significant risk factor.
And again, was it just the extreme users affected here, or did moderate use also show a link?
No, it wasn't just the extremes. Moderate use in this age group, remember, around 4 hours a day, also carried a significantly greater risk.
Okay.
Moderate users also faced a significantly increased risk of depression diagnoses, about 1.6 times more likely, and anxiety diagnoses, about 1.5 times more likely, compared to the low users.
So even 4 hours a day showed a measurable increase in risk for clinical diagnoses in teens.
That's what this data suggests, yes.
Yeah.
And if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, the researchers speculate why adolescents might be more affected.
Yeah, why the bigger impact on teens?
Well, there are several factors that are particularly relevant in that age group. They're much more likely to have social media accounts, for one.
Sure.
And social media can potentially replace some of those crucial face-to-face interactions that are so vital for development during adolescence.
Right, displacing in-person time.
Exactly. And higher smartphone ownership in this age group can also lead to other issues, like potential internet addiction, maybe excessive gaming, definitely sleep disruption.
Oh yeah, the phone by the bed.
Right. Or even negative impacts on real-world social interactions when phones are constantly present during in-person gatherings. It's likely a complex web of potential influences stacking up.
Which inevitably brings us to that crucial question that always comes up with this kind of research: causation.
The chicken or the egg.
Exactly. Does screen time cause lower psychological well-being, or do existing mental health issues lead young people to maybe withdraw and spend more time on screens? This study gave us a powerful snapshot in time, right?
Yes, it's cross-sectional.
So, because it's just a snapshot, it can't definitively tell us if screen time causes the lower well-being, or if lower well-being leads to more screen time. It's like seeing two things together in a photo, but not knowing which one actually happened first.
That's an excellent clarification and a really important point about the limitations of this specific study design. However, the study's discussion section does provide broader context by citing other research that helps shed some light on this.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Well, they point to several longitudinal studies. Think of those more like a movie of people's lives over time rather than just a single snapshot.
Right, tracking people over time.
Yes. And those studies suggest that increases in recreational screen time often seem to precede lower psychological well-being among children, adolescents, and even adults. So the screen time increase comes first.
Interesting. So other research hints at the direction.
It does. And furthermore, there's also experimental evidence that supports this direction. For example, some studies have shown that the mere presence of smartphones can lower enjoyment during face-to-face social interactions.
Just having it on the table, even if you're not using it.
Exactly. And other experiments, like having people abstain from social media use for just a week, have shown measurable increases in well-being.
Okay.
So while this particular large cross-sectional study can't definitively state causation on its own, there's a growing body of other evidence, longitudinal and experimental, that supports at least some of the causation moving from screen time to lower well-being.
Got it. And regardless of the precise direction, cause and effect-wise, the study concludes that these associations they found have, and I'm quoting here, meaningful clinical implications for screening and intervention.
Precisely.
So they're not just interesting statistics floating out there. They have real-world impact and relevance for doctors, parents, kids.
Absolutely. The practical relevance is significant, especially for healthcare providers. Just assessing screen time, asking about it, can become a valuable, relatively simple tool for doctors and nurses to identify children and adolescents who might be at higher risk for mental health issues.
Like a potential red flag to explore further.
Exactly. It opens up a crucial conversation about the possible role of screens in a young person's mental health, moving beyond just general advice to a more targeted assessment based on their actual usage patterns.
Now, it's important we understand the full picture, and you mentioned limitations earlier. Every study, no matter how robust, has them.
Hmm.
So what were some of the specific limitations of this research that listeners should probably be aware of?
Yeah, definitely good to keep those in mind. First, as we touched on, the screen time data was reported by caregivers, not the children or teens themselves, especially for the older ones.
Right.
And it's accurate, especially for younger children. They might underestimate actual use for teens, for example. And potentially, those reports could be influenced by the caregiver's own perceptions of their child's well-being.
Okay, so potential bias there.
A possibility, though the diagnosis data is likely more objective. Second, the survey only assessed weekday screen time.
Not weekends.
Not explicitly asked about weekends in this data set. However, the researchers pointed out that previous research suggests weekday and weekend use tend to show pretty similar associations with well-being, so it's likely still representative overall.
Okay. Anything else?
Yes. Third, the survey items combine TV and electronic games into one single question.
Ah, so you can't tell the difference between watching TV and playing video games from that.
Exactly. That prevented them from differentiating the specific impacts of, say, traditional passive TV viewing versus more interactive digital media like smartphones or tablets or specific game types.
That seems like an important distinction for future research.
Definitely. And finally, while the sample was large and nationally representative, the response rate was about 40.7%.
Which means almost 60% didn't respond.
Right. And that means some groups, like Black Americans, for instance, were potentially underrepresented in the final sample compared to the overall population. So these are all factors to keep in mind. They encourage critical thinking about the data and highlight areas where more research could be useful.
Okay, good to know. So to sum it all up then, this major study provides pretty substantial evidence, wouldn't you say? Evidence of a negative association between increasing screen time and lower psychological well-being in kids and teens.
I think that's fair to say yes.
And critically, this seems to kick in after about an hour a day. Beyond that, we see this consistent decline in various aspects of well-being, impacting everything from basic curiosity and self-control, all the way up to, especially for the older age groups, actual diagnoses of anxiety and depression.
It's a clear and, I think, compelling signal from a very large data set.
And this is where it really hits home for all of us, right?
Yeah.
This is about more than just statistics on a page.
Absolutely.
Screen time is one of those factors linked to mental health that is truly, well, it's amenable to change, isn't it?
That's a key point. Unlike many other influences on mental health, like maybe genetic predispositions or past trauma, which are much harder or impossible to change, how children and adolescents spend their leisure time with screens is something that potentially can be influenced.
It's within our sphere of agency, so to speak.
Exactly. As individuals, as families, as communities.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? Considering that this is a factor we can potentially address, what responsibility might we all share? As individuals, as parents, as educators, maybe even as tech innovators. What role do we play in shaping healthier digital environments for the next generation?
It really prompts some big questions.
It does. What conversations might this research spark in your own life, or maybe in your community? Perhaps it's a call to examine your own screen habits, or to think critically about how you might foster a more balanced digital diet for the young people in your life, not just for their physical health, which we often hear about, but crucially for their mental well-being too. Something to really mull over